Good afternoon. My name is Wenxin Ye. I am professor of history here at UC Berkeley and director Institute of the East Asian Studies. I am delighted to welcome all of you to this special conference, Forms of Exchange, China and the Muslim World. This is a conference that's been co-organized by the Institute of East Asian Studies, alongside with Center for Mid-Eastern Studies, and then also Institute of Slavic, Southeast Asian, Slavic, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies. So it's to my colleagues of the ICES as well as Center for Mid-Eastern Studies, I would like to extend my warmest gratitude. And then, of course, it goes without saying that I extend to all of you, especially our panelists who have traveled long distance to come here to Berkeley, my warmest welcome. We have a full program organized for today and tomorrow. By and large, we divide our topics into 3 panels. We title our conference Forms of Exchange, China and the Muslim World. Now, Muslim population is a sizable population within China, even though it's not necessarily among the most visible segment of Chinese population. China's relationship as a country with Muslim countries in this world has been a very important part of China's self-positioning in this world. So as we think about forms of exchange, we have issues at multiple levels that we would like to engage in. And then, of course, forms of exchange are not necessarily about exchanges between 2 different types of self-enclosed or self-coherent entities, namely China on the one hand and Muslim world on the other hand. One of the objectives of this set of discussion is exactly to give ourselves an opportunity to think through the constitution or the formation of China, as well as the Muslim world in a dialogic context. So we will have an opportunity to do our wrap-up remarks and further discussions tomorrow at the end of the day. So without further ado, let me just turn to the presentations of the first panel and introduce my colleague, Professor Nazar Asayat, who is professor of in the Department of Architecture, director of the Center for Mid-Eastern Studies, who has been a colleague here on this campus, along with me for decades. We talked about, we just shared some recollections a while ago about the 2 of us wanting to co-organize something. We've talked about that for more than a decade, and I'm truly delighted that finally we're doing this here together today. Nazar, please.
Thank you very much, Wenxin. It is indeed a pleasure to be here with you today and to open the activities of this conference. I would also like to thank Dr. Caverly-Carey and the staff of the Institute of East Asian Studies for taking the initiative to plan and organize such an ambitious and compelling conference, as well as my colleague Emily Gottrich, who was in fact the liaison. She's the vice chair of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, who was the liaison on this project. We in the Center for Middle Eastern Studies have always approached our region of the world with a transnational perspective in mind. What this basically means is we try to ask questions not necessarily from the center of the Middle East, but rather of what elsewhere would ask as well of the Middle East. In this regard, we are delighted to have an opportunity to be able to engage in an activity like this one, where we are crossing both area study boundaries and disciplinary boundaries. While China's so-called march to its west, i.e. the Muslim world, encompasses a broad area and many different players, the Middle East still holds a special place in this configuration. Although it is neither the largest Muslim population today in the world, in any region, nor the one that has the greatest proximity to China, the Middle East still maintains a symbolic importance for China's Muslims as the birthplace of Islam, nostalgically or simplistically as that might seem in these discussions that we're about to have of technological exchanges, of capital investment, of energy policy, and of international relations. That same birthplace is today the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, China's largest oil supplier, providing it with 1/5 of its oil imports. In exchange, China serves as Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner, ensuring a constant supply of cheap manufactured goods and sophisticated technicians. Egypt, the Arab world's largest country, has also been gravitating towards China, not only since the time of Gamal Abdel Nasser. I recall when I was a child that the visits by Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai to Cairo were among the most important events in the lives of many Egyptians. But even until recently, and we can see that because the first trip that Mohamed Morsi, the Islamist president of post-revolutionary Egypt, if you will, the first trip that he actually made outside of Egypt was to China. A big deal was made out of that in Egypt, clearly signaling a shift away from his predecessors' pro-US, pro-West orientation. Further west, in fact, in the Maghreb, in Algeria, a country with a somewhat poor infrastructure, but extremely rich in wealth in gas and in oil, has also become deeply involved with China. Its president, Bouteflika, granted China $20 billion in government contract, mainly in construction contracts, to build new houses, to build new prisons, shopping malls, airports, and what in fact promises to be one of Africa's longest continuous highways. In fact, as I've learned, particularly from Emily, Chinatowns are now springing up in the suburbs of some of North African cities, particularly Algiers, where Chinese merchants use rudimentary Arabic and French to hawk their wares, towels, linen, sneakers, designer knockoffs, all imported from China. In Algeria specifically, these patterns may actually sound quite familiar. As I'm sure you know, the French invested heavily in Algeria way back then, creating a railway system, planting vineyards, and sending its own small merchants, the Pied Noir, to sell manufactured goods to the locals in a different era. But as we know, that didn't really end very well, either for the French or for the Algerians, who suffered a particularly painful decolonization process. Which raises the question, has the Middle East North Africa region, we normally refer to it as MENA, has that region, as we call it today, simply cast off one colonial master to gain, if you will, a different neo-colonial or imperial one in China? Instead of the FLN fighting the French in the Qasaba of Algiers, will we continue to see the Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb, another terrorist organization that has become quite important on the terrorist scene, attacking Chinese building sites in the Sahara? While we ponder China's involvement in the Muslim world, and I would also say investment, we should not lose sight of the ramification on the local level. How will the Muslim world itself be transformed by China's pivot towards it? In the MENA region itself, is China's support for the Assad regime in Syria a sign of what is to come? Will China's treatment of its own Muslim minorities have implication for its ability to operate in that region, where, as I said a moment ago, the symbol, if not always the reality, of a transnational Islamic community, the idea of the Islamic Ummah, is extremely well and alive, and even alive among the Chinese Muslims? I hope my short comments provide some food for thought And I do expect that many of the panelists will be able to flesh out many of these issues as well as others in the process. I wish you all a very successful conference. One of my tasks is to introduce this upcoming panel, and I will do so by introducing its chair. Professor Peter Bartu is currently a lecturer in Peace and Conflict Studies in the Division of International Studies here at Berkeley. He comes to us with a wealth of experience as a senior mediation expert for the United Nations. He has worked in this capacity on many countries, including Iraq, on the Middle East peace process, on East Timor, Cambodia, and much more recently on Libya. I think his last book also dealt with Libya. Professor Bartu.
Thank you, Nizar. Welcome, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce the first conference. And I'd just like to quickly start with a quick anecdote. In the context of my mediation work with the United Nations, I found myself approximately 12 months ago in South Central Africa, in Malawi, in the capital of Lilongwe, advising the government and some opposition groups on a national dialogue process after the government had fired on a number of demonstrators a few months earlier in what was Malawi's small version of the Arab Spring equivalent. And I was staying along with many business delegations from China, with the embassy and development types and senior Malawi leaders in a brand new hotel that had been established in Lilongwe only 18 months ago, called, in a culturally sensitive way, the Golden Dragon. And it rose very high above the beautiful savanna plains of Malawi. And it was bustling and busy, and we all came down together to breakfast time, business delegations from China and the various other constituencies I outlined. And it struck me after only a few minutes that everyone was deeply unhappy in this bustling, busy breakfast room. And then I realised then that the reason for their unhappiness was that breakfast was could not be identified as either African, Chinese, or continental. And everyone got a very bad start to the day as a consequence. And it seems to me that no matter in what way that cultures meet and exchange and so forth, it's very important to get breakfast unambiguously right to everybody's satisfaction, so you can get off to a good start. And in that context, we are getting off to a very good start with this conference with a distinguished panel. We have the first presenter, Dawn Murphy, from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, who will speak to China's evolving relations with the Middle East in the post-Cold War era. I'm delighted that we have Professor Wang Sulao, who's come all the way from Beijing, who's the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the School of International Studies, to speak to China and Islamist regimes after the Arab Spring. And many of you will know already from his scholarship, Professor Drew Gladney, who will speak to China's Middle East pivot, The Past is Not Prologue. Each speaker has approximately half an hour. We'll begin with Dawn now, and we'll try and move efficiently through this so that we can have a good Q&A session at the end. Thank you very much. Welcome. Dawn?
Thank you. It's great to be here. My presentation today, I just wanted to clarify regarding kind of the broad boundaries of what I'm going to be discussing, because the approach that I take is different than a lot of the other scholars here today, that I'm looking very broadly at China's relations with regions. My work actually looks at China, Middle East, and also China, Sub-Saharan African relations. Today, I'm really just going to be discussing the Middle East aspect. But when I say Middle East, I mean all of the League of Arab, so the Gulf states, plus Iran, plus Turkey, plus Israel, plus most of Northern Africa. There are some exceptions. For example, Sudan I put into Sub-Saharan Africa for various reasons. But essentially, it's what you think of as Middle East plus North Africa. And as far as time frame, my work does actually look at 1949 all the way through 2012, but today I'm going to be discussing the post-Cold War era primarily. Okay. And this particular project, the research for it was conducted in China, Egypt, and South Africa. And in China, actually, I interviewed a number of the Middle Eastern embassies as well. So, for example, Oman, Israel, Bahrain, Palestine, Turkey, Jordan, UAE, Iraq, etc. So this is based on fairly broad interview data of about 120, mostly government officials and scholars across many continents. First, I'm going to talk about China's interests in relations with the Middle East in the post-Cold War era, and then what is its resulting behavior from those interests, and what does that tell us about China's rising power. I would encourage all of you to actually look at the paper I submitted. It goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to be able to provide in 30 minutes. But I really look at many, many, many different foreign policy tools with the purpose of, rather than just looking, for example, at China's relations with Iran or China's relations with Sudan or China's relations, in the oil industry, these very select areas which are quite important. I'm looking much more broadly at the regions. So I'm going to discuss a lot of foreign policy tools quickly today. So as far as interests, the absolute most important interest for China in the Middle East is promoting China's own domestic economic development. And that is through acquiring resources in the Middle East. Those resources are oil and gas, as you know, but also markets. And we're going to look at a number of charts that actually aren't in the written product that I provided for the conference. But I would argue that markets for Chinese goods and services are just as important for China as oil and gas from the region. And services are primarily in the construction industry, and we'll look at that. China also has energy security concerns in the region, which is tied to promoting its own economic development. But stability among countries in the Middle East is very important for them. The next important interest is support for China in the international system, especially in the realm of emerging multipolarity. And then China's own domestic stability. This, in the 2010 and before, this was primarily associated with Xinjiang, concern about Muslim support for Xinjiang from Turkey and from other Muslim countries. In the post-Arab Spring environment, I'm going to talk at the end of the presentation about kind of what's changing in China's interests. But I would say this is more focused on China's own domestic stability, even outside of the Uyghur issue, and to fear over Arab Spring-type revolutions spilling over into China. Whether that fear is rational or not is another issue. And then developing country. China has a very long history of interactions with the Middle East, and I would say that a lot of its behavior actually is formed by its own identity as a developing country and a shared experience of being not just developing, but non-white, non-Western, non-imperial, and those, in some ways, are very politically incorrect terms, right? But developing country is kind of the politically correct version of that, and it used to be, have a lot more meaning. So these are the primary interests. I just wanted to show you some figures. I think it's important to look at how things have changed. So for China's imports, this top line is in red, is to the Middle East, or it's from the Middle East. This is primarily oil and gas. If you look at turning points for the webcast, do I need to be right by the microphone? Does anybody?
Yeah.
Okay. So you look at the turning point, in the late 90s is when you start to see imports coming in from the Middle East. China became a net oil importer, as many of you know, in 1993. As of 2009, it was the number 2 oil importer in the world. 2010, bringing in about 4.8 million barrels per day. That continues to go up. So this upward trend is definitely driven by that. So as of 2010, you've got a little under $100 billion US a year coming in. Thank you very much. Okay. This is just to give you a point of comparison. So the yellow line is the US, the red line is China. You see this overlap here. Going forward, you're either going to see them in parallel or with China exceeding the US, okay? And this is important because when you think about US and energy security and all of that, China imports more oil from Saudi Arabia than the US does now. and more resources from the Middle East than the US does. To break it down by country, just kind of for your information, the top supplier is Saudi, then you've got Iran, Oman, Kuwait, and Iraq. Okay. Now, to show you a breakdown of suppliers globally, you'll see Saudi provides 19% of China's oil, Iran 9%, Oman 7%, Iraq 5%, Kuwait 4%, Libya. This is just to give you an idea of kind of what that distribution looks like. And then in comparison, US oil imports, really from the Middle East, you've got 10% coming in from Saudi, 5% from Iraq, 5% from Algeria. So 47, just to put it in plain terms, 47% of China's oil is coming from the Middle East, and less than 20% of US oil is coming from the Middle East right now. Okay. Exports. This red line again. You see it starts to increase in the late 90s. Right now, you've got about $90 billion US dollars a year of exports. This is primarily light industrial goods, home consumer products. You've got a lot of automobiles in here, textiles. It's a broad range of manufactured goods that are coming in. And again, the yellow here is the US. So as of 2009, China has exceeded the US as an exporter to the Middle East. And the main markets, UAE is the top market, and then you have Turkey, Iran, Saudi, and Egypt. Okay. Overseas contract services, this is primarily construction. When you hear about contract services from China, and you've already mentioned Algeria, et cetera, it tends to be in construction, also telecommunications, and in the finance industry. But if you look here, as of 2009, they're already up to about $23 billion a year in contracts. And to break it out by country, Algeria, as you're saying, number 1. Then you've got Saudi, UAE, Iran, and Libya. Okay. FDI. I show this chart here. So this is the $1 billion US dollar line, and this is going from 2003 to 2009. Does anyone, just as a quiz here, this is about sub-Saharan Africa, does anyone know what this blip would be up at the $5 billion mark in 2008? Anyone at all? So China in 2008 acquired 20% of Standard Bank in South Africa. It was a $5 billion acquisition. This is the largest foreign direct investment project that China's ever been involved with in the continent. It's an anomaly. But other than that, for the entire continent, for sub-Saharan Africa or for Middle East, you're not exceeding 1 billion. So when you see this large Chinese presence, whether it's in Algeria or in Saudi or in Iran, et cetera, these are in general, this is contract services that are happening. This is not necessarily FDI. And I think this is important because when you look at China's motivations, you look at, is it a new colonial power? Is it a new imperial power? Acquiring resources and pursuing profit opportunities via contract services is a different model than buying roads, buying bridges, buying dams. When you see China involved in these large projects, this is more of an issue in sub-Saharan Africa, I would say, in a lot of ways from a PR standpoint. But it impacts the perception of, especially I think, Westerners towards China and China's involvement in these regions. So I just wanted to point out there is a large presence in many ways in these industries, but usually you're seeing it in contract services and not in actual FDI at this point anyway. And that's for many reasons. I mean, some of these countries aren't receptive to FDI. Saudi is not going, for example, may not allow Chinese firms to come in. In other environments, China may not want to take the risk associated with going in, right? To give you a breakdown here, again, this is the $300 million line. So, I mean, that could be one project, honestly, in some of these environments, right? But Turkey is the top market. Algeria, Egypt, Iran, Saudi. A lot of this investment's happening in the manufacturing sector. It's targeting population centers. It's kind of where you would expect to see FDI occurring. Okay. And actually, here, Iran in 2008, it goes under zero, and that's because Iran that year invested more in China than China invested in Iran. Okay. That was to give you a very high overview of China's interest before we talk about behavior and some context. So now we'll talk about China's behavior. And I'm going to throw some social science, political sciencey type stuff out there just because this is how my project is framed and to provide kind of a larger framing of the issue. But the two hypotheses that I'm interested in looking at overall is as China's overall economic capability increases, does it seek to change the international system, particularly in relation to the distribution of power of the system and the rules of the international system? Any of you who are political scientists, this is very much based on Robert Gilpin's work, power transition theory. This whole concept of rising powers ultimately are going to challenge the hegemon in the system. Okay. And so in order to examine these hypotheses, I actually categorize each of China's behaviors, each of foreign policy tools, into certain behavior categories. Going from status quo integrationist, this would mean basically embracing the international system, really adopting norms in the international system, perhaps being socialized into that system. Status quo pragmatic would mean not pushing against the current system, but doing it, for really practical reasons. Revisionist anti-hegemonic would be pushing for change, but not attempting to overthrow the system completely. And revisionist radical would be wanting to overthrow the system. So you look back in Mao days, China providing arms to insurgency groups and anti-colonial struggles, that was revisionist radical behavior, right? They were trying to actually overthrow the system. Revisionist anti-hegemonic would be wanting to maybe change some of the norms of the international system, but without actually replacing that system. Okay. So we're going to talk about specific foreign policy tools now. The China-Arab States Cooperation Forum. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of this? Has anyone heard of it? Okay, a couple people. How many of you have heard of the Forum on Africa-China Cooperation, FOCAC? A few more. Okay. So China's using these cooperation forums. I'm going to discuss both of them. The first one, the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum, it was founded in 2004. It includes all of the members of the Arab League. The Arab League is actually the organization that coordinates on the Arab side, and it meets every 2 years. This organization, it encompasses basically all functional areas that you can imagine two states interacting in, so political, economic, security, cultural, education, across the board. Right? The next cooperation forum is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. It was founded in 2000 with 50 African states. It basically includes all African states in the continent that recognize the PRC as opposed to Taiwan, and it meets every 3 years. When I look at China's behavior in these two forums, I categorize this as revisionist anti-hegemonic towards both the distribution of power in the system and the rules for a number of reasons. Both of these forums exclude other great powers, exclude the United States. They are promoting norms that are in direct opposition to the liberal international order. So, for example, they're based on the main political grounding of these forums is the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which many of you are familiar with. Most important here would be respect for territorial and sovereignty and mutual non-interference in other states. So that's in direct opposition to the promotion of democracy, human rights, good governance in the liberal international order. On the economic side, as opposed to promoting free market capitalism, it's very much more of a state-led capitalist intervention in the markets type of model. So I would say that's also in opposition to the liberal economic order. And we can, if you guys want to talk about this in more detail, we can. But overall, I end up classifying this as revisionist anti-hegemonic. Special envoy, the next foreign policy tool. China in 2002 set up a special envoy essentially to help contribute to the Middle East peace process in the Arab-Israeli conflict. I classify this as revisionist anti-hegemonic because in general China is siding with the Arab states in contrast with the U.S. approach of supporting Israel. And I do want to point out, right now I'm really working through how to label some of these things because, for example, in the Middle East, you could label the U.S. as the revisionist power around a lot of these issues, and China is the status quo power, right? But my point here is that the U.S. and China approach differ. China actually is seen as a very balanced player, I would say, in the Middle East peace process, has good relations with Israel, good relations with the Arab states, is not, other than attempting to demonstrate that it's interested in this issue, it's not it's not having a major impact actually on the peace process, but this is how it's attempted to demonstrate to Arab states that it cares about this issue and that it does want to see it resolved. Next would be China's voting in the United Nations Security Council. What I look at here is where have the US and China voted differently in the council. You'll see here in the 1990s, it tends to be Iraq, Libya, Arab-Israeli. The issues where you tend to see differences are either around territorial sovereignty, which would include sanctions and jurisdiction of criminal courts, so China abstaining on those issues in general. The other place where you see differences is over the Arab-Israeli conflict. So China supporting a resolution against Israel and the US vetoing it or abstaining. You see this continue through the 2000s. I won't go into a lot of detail here because I don't have enough time. This goes on through the 2000s. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, that there is definitely a change in behavior in 2011 in the post-Arab Spring environment of China issuing 3 vetoes in the last couple of years over the Syria issue. Before this, in all of the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, you only had 1 China veto this entire time frame from 1990 forward, and that was around sanctions for Zimbabwe. So I would love to hear what the other panelists have to say about this. I mean, but this is, there definitely does appear to be in the wake of the Arab Spring, and I would say also with the pivot to Asia and some other factors that are occurring, there's a strengthening of this desire for territorial sovereignty, a need to stand up to the West a bit about anti-interventionist behavior. So this Security Council voting I also classify as revisionist anti-hegemonic. Top leader travel. See here, I mean, this is not surprising when you look at where Jiang Zemin and his administration went. The most frequent visits were Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, Turkey, Iran, etc. And same thing with Hu Jintao, Egypt, Saudi, Morocco, Turkey, UAE. I mean, these visits, it's basically trying to establish positive relations with the most important countries in the regions, ultimately to increase China's influence. I classify this as revisionist anti-hegemonic. I don't... revisionist anti-hegemonic doesn't mean that China actually has the desire to change things, but its behavior may be changing things. So by targeting these regional powers for these strategic partnerships, I do think China is increasing its influence in the region, and so that's why it's classified this way. Strategic partnerships, Egypt, Saudi, Algeria, Turkey, UAE. What countries are not on here that you would think if China's pursuing partnerships with its most important partners in the region, who's not on here? Did I hear Iran? Yes. So Iran and Israel are the two that are not on here that I would argue under other, it would actually make sense for them to be here. And my impression is that the reason they're not included is because of China not wanting to send the wrong messages to the US and to the Arab states about its intentions in the region. Okay. So China is being careful about the signals that it's sending to those audiences. State support for Chinese companies, I won't go into this in detail, but essentially China has provided many, many different types of support for state-owned companies going into these regions to establish markets for contract services for investment. Everything from financing to subsidies to encouraging this behavior through the cooperation forums, coming out with national proclamations that there's a desire to go into these regions. FTAs, China is pursuing an FTA with the Gulf Cooperation Council. This has been ongoing. It's still being negotiated. I think it will actually eventually be concluded. But this is the only FTA that they're pursuing in the region. And again, I classify it as revisionist anti-hegemonic just towards the distribution of power, because the intent is to increase China's exports and economic influence in the region. Special economic zones, the only ones that have been established were in Algeria, and that one's been suspended. And that was suspended before the Arab Spring or anything. It was having some trouble. And then Egypt, this is the Suez Canal Special Economic Zone. And actually that is up and running, not as well as as anyone would hope, but it is up and running. And I classify this behavior just as status quo pragmatic. China provides minimal support. Companies, usually, private companies, have to take the initiative, get the funding, go through the process. And these special economic zones are really targeted at establishing a manufacturing presence in the country for these kind of small and medium-sized enterprises. Confucius Institutes, this is just kind of FYI on the cultural side. They've established many across the region, 2 in Egypt, 2 in Turkey, 2 in the UAE. I also classify this as status quo pragmatic. I don't think that, anything other than encouraging some positive views about China. But again, it's based on the initiative of the individual institutions and schools within the countries to apply for this money and to set up the schools. Okay. Peacekeeping operations. China's involvement in UNPKO has been limited. In the 1990s, they were just sending observers. In the 2001 to 2012 timeframe, the 2 places where you see UNPKO would be Lebanon. They've contributed 3,971 troops so far, and then this supervision mission in Syria, 58 observers. I classify this as status quo integrationist. It's very much working through the United Nations with other countries in a multilateral fashion in this realm. Anti-piracy, you guys may be aware of this, but China's been involved in multilateral anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden in coordination with many other countries, including the U.S. This started in 2008. It's the first time that that the Chinese Navy has deployed outside of, kind of China's territorial perimeters for this type of operation. So it was significant. But again, I classify this as status quo integrationist because it's been done very much in cooperation with the international community under UN Security Council guidance. Conventional arms sales. This starts in 1978, goes through 2010. Does anyone know what that is? So why would 1980 to 1990?
Iran-Iraq?
Yeah. So China was providing a whole bunch of arms to both sides during the Iran-Iraq War, right? But after that, honestly, it's been quite minimal. You don't see, as China's economic power is increasing, that it's increasingly providing arms. I classify this as status quo pragmatic. I think it's primarily driven by arms firms in China wanting to find a market, and many of these countries provide a good outlet for that because of the type of arms they're looking for. So this I classify as status quo pragmatic. Military exchanges. China's conducted military exchanges with every country in the Middle East except for Iraq over the last 10 years or so. I classify this revisionist anti-hegemonic because of some statistical work that I've looked at as far as them targeting kind of the regional powers in the region for these type of interactions. Impact of the Arab Spring, just very quickly. The biggest changes I'm seeing so far, increased concern over the security of China's firms and citizens in these countries. So I think more of a hesitancy in pursuing projects. Also, an increased desire to ensure China's own sovereignty and therefore taking a stand in the international arena about sovereignty issues. It's very early in the process, but I am starting to hear more and more reference to what's happening in Asia and the pivot to Asia and the need for China to stand up to the West or stand up to the U.S. in other regions. So I think right now that's more kind of the thinking is developing on that. Other than Syria, I don't see any concrete action occurring in that realm. But I think those are the major influences. And related to that would be this kind of China-Russia cooperation in relation to the Middle East that you see. What type of rising power is China? I argue that essentially it's a mercantilist developing rising power. So it's mostly driven by economic interests. It's the first developing rising power that we've seen that has that type of identity. If you look at what we've talked about today in the military realm, The behavior is status quo integrationist. In political, economic, and foreign aid, it tends to be more revisionist, anti-hegemonic. I argue that that's tied to China's interests. China doesn't have any actual territorial interests in these regions. In the military realm, it would rather go through international organizations and send positive signals to the regions that it's a benign actor. But in the political and economic realm, it has incredibly strong vested interests and a need to push back against some of the norms in the international system that don't meet its needs. These are the tools that we specifically discussed and where they fell. And then this is more of the tools when you get into the status quo pragmatic on the military arms sales. But again, you see this division. It's just the tools that we already discussed. And that is it. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Well, I find myself a little bit between a rock and a hard place here, because I hopefully feel like my presentation and my paper is not as detailed as Professor Wong's and focused on Egypt and China relations, nor as broad as Professor Murphy's. And so I'll exercise my right as now a somewhat senior anthropologist to talk both more broadly and more specifically than either of them. Let's see. Okay, well, let's see if I can get it. Let's not activate. Let's just try. Okay, that's right. Let's see if we can get it to go. Yeah, okay. What I really want to do is also reflect a little bit on the fact of this wonderful conference and 2 days of meetings to talk about China and the Muslim world. I just am so thrilled to be here for such an event. My first time to Berkeley was in 1982 as a CSC PRC grantee for my interview. And it was with, in Mandarin and written 3 hours, I believe, back then. And it was with Professor Frederick Wakeman, our dear late scholar and dear friend. And I had just come from Beijing, where I was at Beida, and discovered my first encounter with the Muslim world and my first meeting with Muslims. I didn't know there were Muslims in China. I came back and told my advisor, I wanted to study Muslims in China. He said, there are Muslims in China? And he was a China scholar. And he said, no, don't waste your time on Muslims in China. First of all, they're not Chinese. They're barbarians. And if you must study minorities, at least study the Buddhists, the Tibetans, the Mongols. At least they're somewhat Chinese. And it was an uphill battle, to say the least. And then when I got interested in the topic, the first book I read, which had come out in 1981, was by a former Berkeley graduate, Raphael Israeli. And the title of that book was Muslims in China, A Study in Cultural Confrontation. And if you know that book, the entire argument was basically that Islam and China is like oil and water. They don't mix. And you either have jihad in a country of al-Islam, or if it's not a country of al-Islam, it's al-Harab. And you either had one or the other. And a Muslim minority in a non-Muslim country, particularly a communist country like China, was just not going to work. And his book basically goes through all the horrendous difficulties that Muslims had in China. And I read it somewhat differently from my experience in Beijing and meeting some Hui friends for the first time. And I came into the interview thinking, this is the thesis I'm going to tear apart. And I proceeded to knock it down one by one and argue very forcefully. And then Professor Wakeman said, oh, that was my student. I thought, well, there goes that grant. But what was exciting about that was not only had Raphael Israeli written one of the first books on this subject, but he opened the way for a discussion like we're having today of several generations. Whether you agree with his position or not, and he's still writing, he's still producing books. I don't think he's really changed his mind despite my critiques. But nevertheless, to have this kind of discussion to have not only a discussion about Muslims in China, but also Muslims' role in China's Middle Eastern relations, which is where my topic is going to go, and my discussion is going to go, I think is very important. So I want to talk about both more broadly, China's Middle East pivot, and also more narrowly about China's Muslims and the effect that it has had on them, and their effect perhaps on this new position. Now, of course, I think we can date China's Middle East pivot, to use the Obama rhetoric. And for the U.S., it may be more rhetoric. For China, it's reality. That in 1993, we know China became an oil importing nation. And to sustain its trajectory, if my pointer is strong enough, if I could borrow yours, yeah. Thanks. An article that I co-wrote with one of my colleagues, James Dorian at the East-West Center at the time, who since went to work for the State Department and has been an energy advisor in the West Wing. He's had a very, very successful career on energy policy in the U.S. His first book was about minerals in Xinjiang. And so we began talking about the role of this need for energy dependency in China and its effect on the local populations. And we first published this article, and I think since then, of course, this has been a very hot topic of discussion. And of course, China's march to the Middle East has meant a kind of unfolding, as we saw in the Olympics, as we saw a kind of portrayal of China as the next power on the world. And its portrayal as a dragon, sort of gobbling up these resources. As we begin to see, the situation is much more complicated than as portrayed in the unfolding, almost manifest destiny of Chinese civilization. But to look at China's developmental strategy, of course, we know that under Deng Xiaoping and then under Jiang Zemin, there's been a progressive development in this policy. And it's really, this new policy really started in the late Jiang Zemin, continued under Hu Jintao, and definitely, certainly on the agenda of Xi Jinping, that the Great West, the modern Silk Road, will be an important corridor for China's developing relations with the Middle East. And it is this policy that I think is very critical to China's bringing the West into the East and its march west, really to quote Peter Perdue. What is important for that, it's the same map, but we lost it. Well, let's try to go back up. Maybe here we go. Do you know where the thing? Oh, there it is. Okay, hopefully we won't hit that button again. So this is a movie map. You won't see the whole thing. We don't have time, but if you want it, I'll give the website at the end. And it was inspired by the Electronic Cultural Atlas Initiative that Caverly Carey has been a long-term partner of and part of here at Berkeley, centered here at Berkeley. And there's a moving map there of the Mongolian Empire. And that inspired us at the Pacific Basin Institute at Pomona College to develop this moving map of Chinese history. And what becomes very obvious as you watch this map is how little China has engaged its own West, and how important that West has been over the centuries as China has developed, and how untrammeled territory it is for Chinese dynasties and empires. So China's march to the West and the autonomous regions that are part of this march are very critical to its own Middle Eastern pivot, and it's going to continue. Of course, we know, as Professor Murphy has shown us very with great detail, that China's energy deficit has been driving this march, but also China's own internal development. So I don't need, her paper is wonderful. I strongly suggest that you take a very good look at this. And particularly, I think the whole shift in Chinese population towards this energy-dependent drive. So unraveling China's agenda in the Middle East has been a subject of discussion among scholars. Also, another Berkeley scholar, Yitzhak Shakur, who wrote about this problem when he was there, when he was here. And of course, it's something that has been of of great discussion in not only this conference, but all throughout the media. Particularly China's own domestic economy, how easily it is affected by the recent events in the Middle East. We've been looking at China's economy faltering somewhat, and so clearly China's own dependency on Middle East has been inspiring many of these visits that Professor Wang has been detailing for us, so I won't dwell on them. But one thing I will mention, that in terms of imports and exports, this Middle East pivot did not only just include the Arab states, but also Israel. And I wanted to look a little bit in this talk more generally on China's overall pattern of diplomatic relationships with the Middle East, which has changed over time. And that's why I subtitled my talk, "The Past is Not Prologue." What we see is a shift from ideology to pragmatism and to interest base, as Professor Wang has been talking about. Now, I've taken inspiration by the late Chinese scholar Zhang Xiaodong, who unfortunately passed away last year, who really has been heralded as a East policy, China's Middle East policy prophet, I think accurately so, because prior to his writing, China's policy on the Middle East was not interest-based, was not pragmatic, it was driven by ideology. But when he began to write in the early 90s, he started to suggest about China's engagement with the Middle East, involvement with the Middle East, and not only the Middle East, of course, North Africa. And it's basically interesting that his suggestions, and as a scholar writing in scholarly venues, did, I think, have a very strong impact in policy. And when I used to meet with him in Honolulu at many events at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies on energy security issues, as well as the East West Center, he was always very concerned that China adjust its ideologically based policy towards Middle Eastern nations and change its attitude towards its own domestic Muslim population in promoting their role. What was interesting about what happened with China in Sudan is it was entirely against its own previous policy and laws against separatism. In other words, the issue of whether this is non-intervention or not, it was clearly China's own law about successionism. Certainly for China's own domestic reasons, this law was passed. But I took great notice of that when I was thinking about Zhang Xiaodong's prognosis, the recommendation that China become engaged. So when China recognized and became engaged in the negotiations with Southern Sudan, I thought that was a real watershed event, and it showed a very different position in China's policy. So if we look at China's overall engagement with the Middle East, I think certain kinds of patterns will emerge. Of course, we know the historic significance of the Silk Road and the modern Silk Road, which is re-emerging. And it really was Yitzhak Shakur who was the first, I think, to really think seriously about this longue durée of relationship in Middle East foreign policy. Also one of our fellow Xinjiang 13 scholar members. And so he is not only interested in Xinjiang, of course, he's interested in its role and the role of Muslims in China's Middle East policy. I would suggest that if we look at the early 50s to 80 period, we're really looking at a period of legitimation. And it's this period when most of the countries began to recognize China were of socialist background. In the 1990s and 2000, it's really consolidation. And then in 2000 on, it's really, I think, interest-based. Now, if we can look at this map, we begin to see over time how countries began to recognize China according to certain time periods. In the 1949 and 50s, we basically see socialist countries recognizing China, and we say basically led by the Soviet Union, of course, but also note here again, Egypt is very critical in being one of the first countries to recognize China in the 50s, and all the delegations in Syria, and all the visits that went back and forth at this period. It's really in the 60s that we see, of course, China's only a period of sort of a lull in these exchanges and agreements, basically because of China's own domestic upheaval with the Cultural Revolution and its own ideological struggles. In the 70s, we begin to see the Gulf states coming online. And again, this is we begin to see that still very much involved with ideological interests, some trade, but beginning trade relations becomes important. In the 80s, continues with Gulf states. And then in the 90s, this is China's Middle East pivot. This is when Saudi Arabia comes online, recognizes China, but also, don't forget, Israel. And so what's important here is that in the 90s we see this, it's a real pivot away from ideology. It's a pivot towards Saudi Arabia. Now it's one of its largest, if not the largest, import partner for energy sources. And this really shows a difference. China's engagement with the Middle East means that it's now entangled like never before in Middle Eastern politics, something China has sought to resist. And we can see now in China's difficult position it is in with Syria. Because China has had a long-term relationship and trade relationship with Syria. And Jennifer Chang has written about this, I think rather perceptively, that China cannot just sit on the sidelines with Syria. It has tried, but it is very engaged in this. Now, what is striking in the contrast here is the United States engagement in the Middle East and the rise of anti-American protests. Despite China's growing engagement, as Professor Wong has shown us, China has not experienced this kind of backlash, this kind of anti-Chinese sentiment. And we begin to see these kinds of anti-American protests spreading as quickly as the Arab Spring. China has not yet experienced that. There have been some issues, there have been some problems, but overall, China has had a very successful relationship. And I think it is because of this policy of non-intervention, the lack of pressing for some ideological issues, such as President Obama pressed for. But I don't think we would be seeing, in my personal opinion, the kind of upheaval and kind of unrest and also revolution in the Middle East without ideological concerns that President Obama, and I think actually Hillary Clinton's speech probably played very important roles in fomenting this discussion. Now, one problem in all of this sort of rather Teflon relationship with the rest of the Middle East, and particularly, I think, the Arab Street, is Turkey. Now, of course, things have changed dramatically in Turkey's relationship with China in the last couple of years, even under Erdogan, Prime Minister Erdogan. And when I was living in Istanbul in the 80s and 90s, Turkish relations with China were very strained. And basically, many of the issues that Erdogan was able to do, particularly visit Xinjiang, I thought it was interesting that it was in this China power issue of the diplomat that Erdogan's visit gets discussed. The fact that he could go to Xinjiang, in 2012, really is an extraordinary event for a Turkish prime minister, because of course this is where not only are Chinese-Turkish relations warming considerably, but also they've all had a very long-term stumbling block. Just previously, I had attended a conference in Istanbul that Rabia Kadir, Madam Kadir, was also invited to attend, but she was denied a visa and since then has still been denied a visa. But nevertheless, as of 2010, they were still having conferences like this about the Eastern Turkestan problem, and particularly the role of the Uyghur community in that domestic situation for Turkey, that despite Erdogan's own position as prime minister and trying to build a relationship with China, he has the problem of the Turkish street. And he has the problem of the strong sentiment that the Turks feel towards the Uyghurs. Now, many Turks regard the Uyghurs as their ancestors, as their homeland. And of course, the great Ataturk had that theory and belief as well. So for Erdogan to visit, I think we do have to talk about this Uyghur problem for not only China-Turkey relations, but China-Middle Eastern relations. Because, of course, the Muslim problem, which is generally talked about, is not really, in my opinion, a Muslim problem. It's really a Xinjiang problem, and then it's narrowed down to a Uyghur problem. And I'll talk I'll just mention the contrast to that in a minute. But of course, we know this region for China's march to the west is a stumbling block. And the Uyghurs stand in the way of that march to the West. And they've stood up and raised questions. And some of us scholars have tried to give a voice to those questions. They're uncomfortable questions for China. They disrupt China's own vision of its history and its relationship with the Middle East and Central Asia. And I think this work continues to be done, and it's important work to do because many of these people do not have a voice of their own to raise these issues. And of course, we know that the Turkic region, the Turkic languages are very prominent. It's not just the Uyghurs in the region. Not all the Turkic-speaking people agree with some of the Uyghurs on this position. Kazakhs, Kyrgyz have somewhat different views on similar issues. But it really is an interesting fact that by giving the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz nationality status under a Soviet-inspired policy based on the 30s nationalist movement and identifying them all as nationalities has given them a kind of position, a legal, legitimate position by which to voice their oppositions. Now, this is a very extraordinary development for Chinese history because, of course, China is a very multilingual, multicultural country. As Ben Anderson said, it was stretching the tight skin of the nation over this gigantic empire, body of the empire. And I think Anderson's idea is very important here to suggest that China imagined these nations and nationalities. And it was an invention of the 20th century, a term that did not exist. It was a successful invention. In fact, one could argue that it may have been, and I think you could easily make the argument, that this is the most successful nationalist movement the world has ever seen. Because still, the vast majority of nationalities in China want to be recognized, grow in population, and they still get recognized in public sphere. They're important for China's politics. They're important for China, how China represents itself to the world, in terms of the Olympics, as well as to its own country. And they continue to play this very important role of building the nation. So when you have some members of that happy community that are out of step in this march towards the future, it's a very problematic issue for China's own relationship with the Middle East. Now, of course, we know there are large numbers of Muslims in China, and the Uyghurs are only approximately the second largest. These numbers have gone up a little bit since the 2010 census, but not much. About 21, 22 million numbers, but also importantly divided along these old Soviet categories of nationality. Now, I'm only bringing this up not only because I'm an anthropologist and I'm interested in these identity issues, but also because it's important for China's own response to its domestic problems that will, I think, influence its Middle East relations. To me, the real issue for the Eastern Turkestan problem is this. It's migration. That in the 40s, and this is one issue that nobody really disagrees with, even Chinese scholars, Chinese population specialists, sociologists, nobody really denies the fact that in the 1940s, only about 5% of Xinjiang's population was Han. Now, anytime you have this huge minority, now you can dispute, is it 40% Han now? Is it 38%, 44%? Are you counting the Bingtuan? Are you counting the gulags and others? That doesn't really matter. When you have this kind of a huge number of migration that continues apace, whether it's supported by the state, encouraged by the state, those are all issues that can be discussed, and there are others here in this audience that have done a much better job on that than myself. It's nevertheless a problem for any population to have this huge influx of people and this extraordinary development. In China's march to the Middle East, Xinjiang has been a very important pivot in this relationship, and its Middle Eastern pivot, as Owen Lattimore once talked about. But also, the people in the middle might be pawns. Now, I show this not to only illustrate the dramatic development of a place like Urumqi, but this is where I first did field work in Urumqi, and there was nothing more than a 6-story building nearby. This is the Shanxi Mosque for Hui, and what got me to Xinjiang in 1985 was permission to not to study the Uyghurs. It was still an unopened area. Xinjiang for me, as Ningxia was when I went, Fei Kaifang Dichu. But I got permission to go there to study the Hui. And you can see this little beautiful Chinese style, looks like a temple. It's actually a mosque. And you can see the kind of development. And this, of course, this is right where nearby where the riots were in the People's Square. Now, what's important, I think, about these riots is not only that it illustrates the tensions of the regions, but that these riots were so exposed to the Chinese population. Some people call this China's first Twitter revolution, that, of course, as we know, they were sparked by events in southern China that immediately were communicated to the Uyghurs. Uyghur workers were abused in southern China to those in Xinjiang. But of course, that made Beijing nervous about any events in the Middle East coming back to haunt them in the West. Now, China was very, most people just kind of scoff at the idea of a Jasmine Revolution spreading to China, riots in the street. But China's response suggests that they were nervous. Now, what I was kind of surprised by when I went, tried to do more research on this was finding this video, which was a Chinese Central Television video, and we know that China played looped video coverage, media coverage of the riots, somewhat selectively aired, as most of us agree. But this video of the capture of a so-called Uyghur terrorist or separatist was put on a Uyghur website and from Chinese television. So we got a glimpse of the kind of rioting that was, I've written that I think it's more of a Rodney King type situation than as we've had in Tibet. And so I just gave a talk in Beijing and Shanghai 2 weeks ago. They still let me back occasionally. And I asked, did the 7/5, the July 5th riot in 2009 in Urumqi equal China's 9/11? And they laughed. Oh, no way. No, it can't be China's 9/11. And I agree, it's not. And it's not of that dramatic order. But it has led to a sea change of debate in China about this Minzu category. How are they going to treat their Muslims and their Tibetans as nationalities? With problems like they had seen on their own television sets, are they going to revise this whole thing and throw it out? And Professor Wong, one of his colleagues at Beida, Ma Rong, has been in the forefront of leading the discussion about this whole category of nationality and should they dismantle it. And what's interesting about that is that, and if you look at the Baidu results of Ma Rong searches, that in the 90s, you can see that, you probably can't see that, in 2008, 2010, 2009, 2008, nobody knew about Ma Rong. But in 2010, after the 2009 riots, suddenly Baidu, everybody's searching for Ma Rong. And then this term for ethnic policy, Minzu Jiangse. Nobody was really that interested in China in the 2007, 2008, 2009 period about minority policy, ethnic policy, Minzu policy, and then in 2010-11. So in my opinion, it is a 9/11 watershed event in a sense that it's got the entire country interested in what are we going to do about this problem of these rioters. And that, of course, cuts against the whole message of China's unified nationality policy and the sort of support of the nationalities for this state apparatus. Now, of course, the Uyghurs want to call into question these ideas, and that has gotten them thrown in the middle of a world struggle over the issue of terrorism. If they had not been accused by the Chinese of being a terrorist group, they would not have been listed by the U.S. And then the United Nations as a terrorist group, one group, and that wouldn't have landed them in, at least 22 of them, in Guantanamo Bay. Now, most of them have been released, except for, I think there's 5 left, or just 3? 3 left, yeah. Several of them have gone to Palau, we know, and I keep offering to give them surfing lessons, but nobody's taken me up on that. But clearly, it might be a nicer place than Guantanamo Bay, but it's not the place that many Uyghurs want to be. And one has already left for Turkey, where his wife was from. So we begin to see that this Turkish background and culture is still very important to this population, and they get a lot of press. Now, as I mentioned, they would not have been sent to Guantanamo Bay without this. Excuse me. I'm trying to talk over the crowd out there, and I'll try to tie this up. Without the industry of the post-9/11 knowledge agenda about terrorism. And so we have had scholars pop up who've never been to Xinjiang, who know nothing about the region, claiming, yes, we have Al-Qaeda and getting large research grants, and also institutes in China getting large grants to study ethnic policy. Now, when I was lecturing in the 90s in China about this issue, very few of these institutes were interested. Now, many of them are very interested. And of course, we know that prior to 9/11, Xinjiang was very peaceful. And we know the party secretary, party chairman would say there was no terrorism. But after 9/11, suddenly there's terrorism. And there are these Islamist terroristic groups. And so the Uyghurs themselves in the diaspora, with whom I've been spending more time since I can't spend time with them in China, have been, sort of counter discoursing and presenting a counter narrative. And so we have whom I've been calling the Uyghur Dalai Lama. The Uyghurs never had a leader, a central leader. They've never had a Dalai Lama. And of course, Muslims around the world do not have a single leader they look to. The Uyghurs do have a woman now who has been elected president of the World Uyghur Congress, and there she is blessing my baby, and who's been nominated 4 times for World Prize. So this issue is one that complicates China's march west and China's relationship with the Middle East. Interestingly enough, but as we see the shift, not only with the Erdogan visit to China, but also the fact that Obama has still not met with her, whereas the prior administration under President Bush did meet with her and in fact, it was Condi Rice who secured her release. So that does show a shift. They are still a political football, and they are a problem, not only for Beijing, but also for Washington, as they showed in Guantanamo Bay. So it does show that as a transnational diaspora, they are still an important element in this Middle East pivot. They're going to play still a role. And the reason that they are in Munich and very active in DC is the U.S. government funding of things like Radio Liberty and Radio Free Asia. So there's no accident. So the U.S. is very deeply involved with this diaspora population, has been and will continue by necessity to be involved. Now the contrast, and I always feel I need to present this because most people go away thinking, oh, well, China's Muslims are all like the Uyghurs are restive. No, the real Middle Easterners that we know about and that I initially began my studies of China, Muslims in China, was the Hui nationality as a nationality. And the important thing I just want to make a point here is that with China's rising engagement with the Middle East and its pragmatic interest in securing improved relations, their own Muslim population, especially the Hui, not so much the Uyghur, have begun to be more engaged. And I want to speak with Professor Wang about this. What is the role of Hui in foreign diplomacy? Prior to that, when I was in Egypt in the 80s studying the Hui pilgrims and students at the Al-Azhar Masjid, Madrasa, in the central school for Islamic training in the Middle East, they were very, very few and they were very, very reluctant to be used by the state. Now, what's interesting about the Hui, of course, is that unlike the Uyghurs, they are spread out throughout China. They've had a long history of travel and pilgrimage and migration back and forth to China. Some people think that's where they got their name, Hui Hui, to return. But I don't, that's not the historical basis, but certainly there is this engagement historically with the Middle East and the role that they have played. And it really caught my eye that an imam whom I interviewed in the early 80s at Xi'an's Great Mosque took the lead in speaking out about China's Middle East policy during the Iraq War. Never before, and I'd known him for almost 30 years now, had he ever got in the front of a microphone or in a newspaper and spoke out. And at a time when China itself did not condemn the U.S. in the Security Council for its invasion of Iraq. Now, what's important about them, and I wanted to draw your attention to this beautiful painting from a Shandong Hui artist, that for them, this historic interaction with the Middle East, as we can see, not only in use of the Holy Quran and their beautiful art, is significant in that for Muslims in China, particularly the Hui, they were very conflicted about what their position would be. Many of them said, we are Huijiao, we are Muslims, we are not a Minzu. And of course, we know Islamist regimes do criticize the whole idea of nationality, democracy, breaking up the world into the multinational nation-state system and the United Nations. It's one of the main bones of contention that most Islamist groups all agree on and all share. So the Hui and the other Muslims of China were in this debate in the 30s. Eventually, more socialist scholars like Bai Xiaoyi carried the day and said, no, by being a Minzu, you can carry on this tradition, you can have recognition, you can be the Middle Easterners, the ethno-religious mediators, as I call them, that bridges the East and the West. So I think that's a very important reemergence of the role these individual players are beginning to take. So I will conclude. Basically, I don't believe there could be a Beijing Spring in China. I call it a jasmine tea revolution. Basically, it has to be a popular sentiment on the street, as we saw on the Arab street. It can't be anything from the outside. It certainly can't be something sparked by a few disgruntled ethnics on the periphery, like Uyghurs or Tibetans. But if it does resonate, and if China's economy does falter, as people are suggesting, then I think these individual players will be important, and their role in China's relationship with the Middle East will increase. China faces extraordinary domestic challenges to its development, but again, I want to make the point that for its Muslims, religion is not the issue. Hui practice Islam. They're going on pilgrimage in greater numbers. It's really the Xinjiang and the Uyghur problem. But that is a huge problem for China. And it's one it hasn't been able to solve after 60 years of a policy of development and ethnic policy. And as I spoke with some policymakers in China on this trip, it's occurred to me they still haven't been able to think outside the box. Ma Rong is the first one. I don't necessarily agree with his solution. He thinks follow the U.S. model. Things are so, peaceful, and ethnic relations are so positive here. We have an African American president, and he advocates the melting pot theory. I don't think that's going to work, and I don't think it worked here. But basically, I think that there are very important implications for China and its neighbors in this. That when we think about the rise of China, I think we should reconsider the longue durée, the history of the rises of China and its interaction with the West. And finally, the role of international organizations and intellectual and academic conferences like this in discussing that role. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Excellent. Great. Well, thanks very much. That was a terrific series of presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, we have approximately 25, 30 minutes for questions. And I think we have someone up the back with a microphone. So if you'd like to ask a question, can I ask two things? One, that you briefly identify yourself, and then if you know who you'd like to answer, if you can direct your question to our appropriate panelists. And then finally, just keep the microphone close by when you do ask the question so the podcast can pick it up. So if anyone has any questions, we'll begin now. Yep, two up the back.
Yes, the name is Gary Hicks. I'm with the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association, and I only have one simple question, and that is, where can I pick up your papers? How do we get a hold of the papers, the presentations?
That's the one question I can't answer, I'm afraid.
I know.
Someone? Conference organisers down the back? Very good, thank you.
Thank you for your question. I work with the Institute, one of the institutes that's collaborating with this conference. We are making the oral presentations available. We will poll the writers and ask if they are willing to share their papers with the public. Dr. Murphy has mentioned already that she's inviting people to look at them. Anyone whose paper is going to be made available will be linked to our website for the conference. You can get that from us.
Thanks, Cavalier. Very good. Any other? Yep, in the front there.
Hi, I'm a graduate student at UC Berkeley, and I have a question for Professor Wang. You mentioned the position of China to respect the will of the Egyptian people. I'm wondering, given the continuing political instability in Egypt, how far China will go in its support for the people.
Yeah. As I know, Chinese leader our former leader Hu Jintao and the current leader Xi Jinping, they all reiterate that China will help Egypt to try to ease the situation and overcome the serious economic difficulties. But China is still didn't supply with Egypt the fund or the foreign aid as Muslim brothers wish. I heard after last year's Mursi's visit to China, a little bit disappointed feeling among the Muslim brothers. Actually, they attached so important for their visit. But at the same time, as I know, China's commitment to the aid to Egypt already exceed its aid to other countries. To Tunis, another revolutionary country. In 2011, China gave 40 million renminbi the aid. For Afghanistan, our neighbors, in the several years ago, as I know, it's 150 million US dollars. And anyway, the aid to Egypt is not so much, but as I understand, it's appropriate to its current situation. And another very important issue, China's leaders, they are not so confident of current regime. They should take something to be reserved.
Frank, and then the lady.
Frank Redenberg, retired, unaffiliated. I attended the meetings with the International Studies Association about 10 days ago and participated in a couple of symposiums about China. I'm not an expert on the situation at all, but a phrase I kept hearing repeated was the Chinese are conducting international relations solely for their own profit, their own economic advancement, and there is disappointment in various international arenas. You mentioned disappointment in Egypt, Professor Wang, over the size of Chinese aid, but generally in Europe, elsewhere, that China is not seeing itself as, I quote, a responsible stakeholder, unquote, in the international community. It isn't playing that cooperative role with other major countries and institutions in helping secure financial stability, relative broad-based progress, and so forth and so on. Sorry for the fuzziness, but perhaps any one of you has a comment. Professor Murphy as well, perhaps.
Okay, first I say something. First, I partly agree with you that China's international image is closely linked with the economic interest. But from our leaders, top leaders, they don't want to show the world China is an economic animal. But the problem is, currently, most of Chinese enterprises, they are all interest-driven, including China state-owned enterprises like CNPC, the oil giant. The CNPC in China, many people criticize, including me. They have many bad behaviors, like imported oil from the Middle East and other countries, and then export gasoline in a very low prices. If you ask many people in Beijing, many of them dislike CNPC and other the bad record companies. We have our own problems, but from the top, from foreign ministry and the top leaders, they want to show the world the so-called 正能量, how to say that? this is a counter word, the good image. This is my first point. Second point, many people talking about China's responsibility in the international issues. Now, China take lessons. China take lessons from Libyan case. Last year, Libyan case gave a bad lessons for China, so China take lessons, and so China changes policy toward Syria. Now China vetoed the resolution in United Security Council. So, and then many Western countries blame China for responsibility again. I mean, if the world asks China to be more responsibilities, China will veto more times. Does that Western will feel unhappy, to tell the truth? Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Dr. Wang touches on the whole responsible stakeholder. I think it's a very loaded term, and that, so to answer your question specifically, you were talking about economic interests and not, the criticism of not giving enough aid. In other camps, China's criticized for giving too much aid, but the aid is not tied to political conditionality, not tied, is directed towards infrastructure as opposed to what many members of the international aid community would prefer. So just purely on giving aid, I think China's actually giving a lot of aid, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and not just financial grants, but, building hospitals, building schools, training African technicians. I mean, there's many ways in which China is behaving responsibly, but where you hear this responsible stakeholder discourse tends to be more around, is China adhering to Western international norms? And I think Dr. Wang brings up, and something that I'm hearing in my interviewing a lot now, I think especially in the Chinese academic community, there's kind of a backlash, because this responsible term is used as a criticism when China doesn't behave in the way that the US or another Western power wants, right? So in some areas, like what I look at, I think participating in United Nations peacekeeping operations is being a very constructive, responsible power, being an anti-piracy, even if it's driven by economic interests. But when China's own norms, especially around sovereignty or around being a developing country, come into play, they're not living up to the expectations of some in the international community. And I would say also, just as a caveat, in many cases when China does not step up and quote unquote punch its weight, it's being accused of that a lot. And in some cases it's true criticism, sometimes, it's very complicated, but a lot of times China's response to that is, we are still a developing country. And it becomes very complicated because when you have the second largest economy in the world by GDP, but you still have, a very low per capita income, what is China's responsibility? So anyway, I guess it's complicated, right?
Very good.
Dr. Gladney, do you have any? You used in your slide the responsible
Yeah.
term too. So.
Yeah, I did. Well, I'm not sure we really want China to punch its weight.
Right, that's another issue, yeah.
And it does a lot of punching, but not necessarily internationally. So, I think it's China's feeling its way through this. And as I suggested in my talk, it is becoming much more like the Syria case illustrates, I think, very nicely, that there is no real clear agenda that China accepts self-interest, but it's becoming so sort of implicated in these various politics that I'm not sure. The Libya example will be the best example for China to continue to follow, because it's now still somewhat of an outlier in all of this. My sense of just being there for the first time in a while, there's a lot of debate in the academic academies about China's relationship with not just the West, but also the East, if we are the East. And I think that it's this kind of debate is not just in academic forums in China; it's on the street, and people are very, very interested in global events like never before. And we write a lot about media censorship and internet restrictions in China, and they're there. But there are also people who are interested, and can get around them, and people are very, very aware of world events, and not necessarily just giving a party line, because the party line is rather hard to decipher on some of these issues.
Very good. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Antonia. I do research on China in Africa. Just a few questions to Drew. I think the last presenter on the Muslim crisis here. I just have like two questions, but they're out of curiosity. The first one is the emphasis you're making on the Muslim community in China. Do you think they have similar crises with the Christian community in China, or it's something that the Muslim community have, but the Christian community don't also have a voice in China? And if they do, have there been any uprising, or have they tried to, use their religion in a way that it has the government backing, or they're actually having the same opposition or crisis? Then secondly, based on the information you're providing, it's like gradually, if they don't put things into check, they can actually form an uprising in China. Can you link it up to probably what is happening in some West African countries where you have this Islamic groups coming up that are now becoming a threat to the society? Do you see this as a potential threat to the peaceful or the development of China?
Thank you for those questions. They're very astute and hard to answer briefly. I've been sort of working and toying with a larger project on the Judeo-Christian encounter with China and in China. It's sort of a long historical project, and I'm not a historian, so I should have somebody else doing it. But I've just had this very interested because I have a very strong Christian theological training background that I came into Chinese studies from. So I have a personal interest in that. But my sense is that this issue of nationality, the Minzu policy that I briefly alluded to, really divided the Christian issues, which were similar to Muslim issues, from the problems that we see today. By giving the Muslims nationality status, they had a sort of legal voice by which to organize around autonomous regions, etc. And it's that policy that is under great discussion in China. The religious freedom policy, which affects Christians, but also non-Christians, particularly Chinese popular religion, is one that is just exploding in China. Religion is booming. It's a growth industry. If you could take out stock in it, you should, because temples and churches are being built. Missionaries are being sent everywhere. Mormons are doing great in China, as well as the Korean Christian missionaries are all over China, everywhere you go. So it's almost to the extreme that the religionists, the people who are engaged in religious activities, are really having a field day. I mean, there are problems, and there are some groups. But in general, it's the problem for the Uyghurs and the Tibetans is a nationality problem, because they, though being very religious, are categorized as a nationality. And this is, my sense, is what Ma Rong is trying to criticize. Now, on the issue of are there Islamist groups, Salafi groups in particular, in China, that could become a threat to civil society. So far, the more organized ones are among the Hui, and they have been deliberately sort of apolitical. They've tried to keep out of politics. There are some local disputes. They're very radical in terms of their Islamist ideology. Many of them are trained in the Middle East, have come recent pilgrimage. They are very strongly Salafi, but not jihadi, if you can make that distinction. The real issue, it seems to me, in China for civil society is civil unrest, labor unrest, housing issues, corruption, the huge gap between the wealthy and the poor, the widening gap. These kinds of widespread civil society problems affect Christians, Muslims, minorities across the board. So I wouldn't say it is when you see these incidents taking place, it's necessarily a Christian problem or a Muslim problem. It's really an issue of civil society in China, and this horrendous sort of explosion of corruption at all levels. This is what Xi Jinping is trying to reform, but the whole system is sort of geared for a kind of guanxi or relational sort of situation that is very, very hard to reform from the top.
Very good. Thank you. Any Yes.
Hi, my name is Rizwan Mawani from the Graduate Theological Union. This question is also for Drew and sort of tails on the last question that was asked. So the first question is really about internal Muslim relationships within, especially amongst the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and the Hui. We've talked a lot about outward-facing relationships with other Muslim nations, but I wonder if outside of the political domain and outside of the categories of Minzu, we can talk about a Muslim sort of solidarity that exists amongst the Hui and the Uyghurs, and if this can be spoken about outside of the political categories and boundaries of sort of uprising. And the second question is also about this idea of internal diversity within these groups. So if we take the Hui, for example, does the category of Hui or Minzu, first of all, obfuscate further forms of internal diversity, whether it be Qadimu, Salafi, so many of the Sufi tariqas, for example, that exist? And was there a way to talk about this before the official categorization of Minzu amongst the Hui? So, for example, these variety of groups that we now sort of label under this umbrella category, is there a way of resurrecting a vocabulary which allows us to talk about diversity in other kinds of ways?
Yeah, I think it's difficult because that category of nationality or Minzu is so heavy. And I think it's better not to translate it, as I've said before. It's like the term guanxi. It's a Chinese situation. It's very hard to translate. So I just use the term Minzu. It's so heavy on society. It's such a big debate within the Han, saying, "Oh, these people shouldn't be getting these privileges. Look what they're doing. The Tibetans they're not grateful. They should be grateful. The Muslims are, killing us on the street. The Uyghurs." So it's so pervasive in China that it's hard to get around that. And then they get caught in the middle of that. So that Hui can very rarely show sympathy to the Uyghurs. They'll be as outspoken against the Uyghurs as others. And of course, the history of Xinjiang is not one of great Muslim solidarity between Hui and Uyghur. There are some historical issues there that go way back that are hard to go over. Now, of course, when Muslims are celebrating festivals or traveling or a prayer, yeah, there's Islamic solidarity. But I'm afraid that in this socialist system of Minzu, it's very hard for Muslims to reach across. And of course, there are those who've argued that's deliberately a Soviet sort of divide and rule policy, and Chinese would call it yi-zhi, yi-zhi, use the barbarian to defeat the barbarian. So I think that the state, to some extent, owes a great responsibility in preventing this kind of solidarity. Within the factions, the Islamic factions, that's also all very complicated. There have been real tensions, and with this explosion of religion that I was talking about earlier, there's been an explosion of difference and disputes, Islamic disputes within the Muslim communities. So if anything, I would say they're much less organized and in harmony today because of this plethora of outlets and debate and influence from the Middle East and readings and internet usage that they get a lot of information, that they're very caught up in those debates, and the community is very in flux. I think that's really exciting because for the first time they are able to debate among themselves. And if John Bowen's work, Debating Muslims, shows you that this internal discourse, I think, is very healthy. It does show that at one level, civil society, is beginning to flourish at some levels. But at another level, it can turn to very violent. And the history is not good. Interesting that, among the Muslim world community, the Hui are probably some of the most factionalized in the sense that between Sufi groups, they won't intermarry. The Sufis are always the most welcoming and the least factionalized. But it's something that says something about China, right? And it says something about lineage and ancestry and all those aspects of Chinese society that shows how much a part of Chinese culture the Hui really are. And the Uyghurs have been much less involved with Chinese culture for much more recent periods. So.
Very good. Yeah.
Hi, Ned Walker, Political Science and Slavic Institute here on campus. My question is about China as a development model for the Muslim world in general and for the Arab world in particular. And so really the question is, is it a development model? Does it have one? Does the Chinese government try to promote a kind of, well, this is the way the West did it, and this is the way that we did it, and you should follow our model rather than the Western model? I mean, you hear a lot about Asian values, but of course Asian values presumably don't translate very well in the Muslim world. And of course China has very high growth rates, but that's an objective, not a model. That's what you're trying to get, presumably, at least in part. So at any rate, is there a model? Do they have some, appealing alternative that they try to promote? Is there some sort of soft power element to what the Chinese, pivot involves? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your question. Actually, China's model is a controversial issue. Even in our university, in our school, I have a colleague, his name is Pan Wei, Professor Pan Wei, very famous professor. He published a book on China's model. But as a colleague, we criticize him. What's about China's model? Maybe we have Chinese experiences, but if you think Chinese model could be learned by other countries, it's quite different, because we have a totalist party controlled everything. North Korea is eligible to learn, but they didn't want. For Egypt, Morsi, after the Arab Spring, the Muslim brothers, they want to learn many countries' experiences. They mentioned Malaysia. They think Malaysia is a good example. Turkey and China, Singapore. They named many countries. As I know, for China, Chinese leader never said China could export a development model. This is not correct thing. Personally, I disagree, and our leader also disagree. The Chinese experiences is unique. Give you an example. Can Islamic world suffered from fast growing of people population? How to control the population? In China, we have a cruel policy. Even a pregnant woman, for 6 months, the local official could do something to try to kill try to do something to abortion, forced abortion. But in Islam world, it is impossible. When I was young, 20 years ago, I have a quarrel with Egyptian students, because at that time I was living in the same building with Egyptian students. They said that China's policy is bad, something, but now our policy is cruel, but it's good for economic. The policy in the Islamic world, don't control the policy, or it's hard to control the policy. It's one of the reasons for this round of Arab Spring. So
I wanted to answer real quick. I don't think there's a China model in the same way that there's a Washington consensus, with specific components that could be exportable, or a U.S. development. And I agree that China's unique. What I see in my work, though, is I think that China does serve as an inspiration to a lot of countries. To see a country that went from being that poor to developing so quickly, and that it is possible without democracy, without some of these other components that modernization theory would lead you to believe were required. And I also think that Dr. Wang has a very good point about specific elements. So like in Egypt, China has helped to establish a special economic zone. I mean, that's very much based on China's own experience, and it's willing to share that. Throughout Africa, they're setting up agricultural demonstration centers, which they have interest in. I mean, it actually ultimately promotes Chinese agricultural business, but they're willing to help these countries learn from China's own experience in agriculture. And you look at that in many ways. I think that on a micro level, there may be Chinese models of you can do this and we're going to try to export and help you, but not an overall here's an authoritarian system with state-led capitalism, mostly because with such a large economy and population and being so resource endowed, there's not many countries that could follow that model even if they wanted to. So.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions. Yep.
Okay, yes. Can you hear me? Eng Seng Ho, I'm in anthropology and history at Duke. I have a question. My expertise is on the maritime Silk Road Indian Ocean side. I have a question for Professor Wang. You focus a lot on Egypt in your presentation, and you emphasize the long-standing relationship between China and Egypt. It strikes me that, yes, there is this long-standing relationship, but the intermediate powers in the Middle East, such as Egypt and Iraq, have seen a great erosion in their influence over the past decade or so. And you have strange phenomena, such as a small country like Qatar becoming quite influential. And in that sense, I wonder if you could help us think about China's role in the Middle East going forward. I think the relationship with Egypt is established, but perhaps either a little bit past-oriented, or perhaps with some notion that there is an opportunity here to take something from the US. And in that sense, I wonder if one could think of the Middle East in relation to Central Asia, whereby the US is playing in China's backyard. So you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Could China play in the US's backyard in the Middle East as a sort of counter pressure? And in that sense, how would China deal with Saudi Arabia, Iran, and so on? Could China conceive of that sort of policy? Thank you.
We don't have any more time for any more questions after that one. We'll continue discussing that question for the next 3 days. Thank you. No, please do your best. Thank you for that. I'm sure we'll be able to discuss a bit more of that tomorrow too through the various other panels.
Okay, very good questions. I just talk about the China and Islamic regimes. Actually, China, we have strategic thinking on the Middle East after Arab Spring. Now, in the Middle East, we have three mechanisms. One mechanism is the FOCAC, China-African Cooperation Forum. The second is China-Arab Cooperation Forum. The third is China-Gulf Strategic Dialogue. Now we are trying to establish free zone between China and the Gulf regions. Why we are so focused on Egypt, we have our own thinking. Personally, as a scholar, I think why Egypt is so important. You are correctly pointed out that after Arab Spring, a small country, Qatar, now playing a big country's role. Now, Qatar, as I know, was strongly criticized by many countries, including Egypt and UAE and Saudi Arabia, because Qatar strongly supports Muslim Brotherhood, and UAE strongly criticized Muslim Brotherhood. And after Arab Spring, in the past, China's allies in the Middle East, our economic ally, Saudi Arabia, Iran. Now, after the Arab Spring, who is China's reliable partner? And after Arab Spring, the Middle East will go back to its native color, green color. After Arab Spring, Islamists will play a more and more important political role. This is a trend. With Egypt, has a good relation with Egypt, can continue China's relation, a good relation with other possible and future Islamist states. And China don't want Turkey play a very important role in the Middle East. Many reasons. Other scholars already say that, including China's Xinjiang problems. And Egypt could pay off its role. We hope Middle East has many countries, Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. These 4 countries is the most powerful country now in the Middle East. We hope all of them play some kind of role. We dislike one country, just like ambitious Erdogan want to reach Turkey's predominance influence to other countries. We dislike that. We dislike. So we hope to have a balanced Middle East policy after Arab Spring. With Islamist regimes is our focus, and also with traditional country which has a long-term historical friendship like Egypt, also Sudan, Algeria, and Yemen. Those countries disagree with Qatar. They disagree. Qatar help Syrian oppositions to replace Syrian government's status in Arab League. China didn't want to make trouble in the Middle East, but we hope to keep a balance to safeguard Chinese interest. Thank you.
Well, that was an excellent response. Thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I just have one housekeeping point, which is that before thanking our panel and closing today, tomorrow our proceedings will begin at 9:30 at the Institute for East Asian Studies on Fulton Street, which for those of you who are new here is the southwest corner of the campus and keep going downhill basically. It's adjacent to the stadium. While the proceedings do begin at 9:30, I can confirm that there will be an unambiguous continental breakfast served at 9 o'clock for your enjoyment as well if you arrive early. Please join me in thanking our panel for an excellent discussion. Thank you.